Welcome to CSIS. I'm Sujay Shivakumar, Senior Fellow here at CSIS. And today we are very privileged to have with us Marc Fasteau, who with Ian Fletcher has recently published a remarkably comprehensive book on industrial policy in the United States. Marc is a successful entrepreneur, founder of an insurance company, a lawyer by training and an investment banker, among other credits. And he has shown an abiding and deep concern for the US economy and its competitive position in the world. This book is very timely. It addresses today's policy imperatives, driven in large part by the industrial decline of the United States and the challenge posed by foreign industrial policies to the US economy, and in particular China's emergence as a manufacturing powerhouse and an innovation near peer. The book advocates for a coherent and comprehensive industrial policy for the United States, taking on a dominant and, in my view, a correct view, an incorrect view, that industrial policy has not worked and cannot work. I think this belief defies both our history as well as current practice, both here as well as abroad. So given that, we look forward to exploring with you, Marc, the features of a successful industrial policy and how we can build on our strengths and successes. Joining me in the studio today is Charles Wessner, an internationally recognized expert on innovation policy from Georgetown University, and I'm proud to say a senior advisor with our program here at CSIS on Renewing American Innovation. So welcome to you.
Glad to be here.
So, I guess the first question that one would ask is, looking at the book in front of us, which is quite considerable, what prompted you to write this book, and what do you see as today's main economic crisis? What is the cri de coeur that prompted this?
Well, you actually did a pretty good job of answering that question for me. Industrial decline. It's gotten to a very serious state between 1991 and 2019. We lost 3,500,000 manufacturing jobs to trade. We lost more than that. Some were lost to automation. We have a trade deficit in goods and manufactured goods of about $1 trillion a year. That's a lot. That's real money. Deficits are real money. It's not just accounting entries. And really strikingly, we have a growing $200 billion a year trade deficit in advanced technology products. That's what we're supposed to be the leaders in. And it has caused economic devastation in parts of our country. And productivity is actually declining if you measure it properly. And those are all really bad things. I mean, they're bad for the country. I think they're also bad for our politics. People look for explanations and they don't get them. And I think they really haven't gotten good answers from either party for 30 years. They get angry, and angry makes for bad politics. So that's why I thought it was worth making the effort.
So, one of the questions that you pose almost immediately in the book is the challenge to the orthodox thinking about free market economics. I guess the question is, are we with a free market mindset have the tools to really compete with China, whose industries are facilitated by the state?
Well, facilitated is a polite word for what they actually do. They subsidize the industries that they consider important economically and important strategically, militarily, and so on. I guess the summary is, if you're dealing with another substantial size country that has a real vigorous industrial policy like China, where they pick industries and they subsidize them when they consider it important, almost to an unlimited extent. If you don't have an industrial policy, you're part of their industrial policy. We'll lose the industries, as we have been losing the industries that they target. Japan did it earlier, they're not the same adversary, they're friends, but they did it a little more subtly, but they did it. They took a big chunk of our car industry. You guys know the story. So, but it's really, well, what's the core of industrial policy? Why does it work? Why can't we leave it to the free market? First of all, in trade, there's free market, domestic policies. Let's put that to the side for a minute. In trade, there is no free market. The only two countries, maybe Australia, I don't know, who really have believed in it are the US and the UK. UK is an industrial wreck, unfortunately. And everybody else has industrial policy. It's not like here's their economy and there's, oh yeah, we do industrial policy. Industrial policy is how they run their economies. And the distinction between, government should stay out of business, which has been our mantra, not all bad, by the way, but is something foreign to them. They believe, Japan believes that government should be deeply involved in directing the course of the economy and so on. So the history of trade, which was, we were protectionist until the end of World War II. That's how we got to be as strong, as powerful economically as we were, is that other countries kept protecting their economies, and they agreed in theory to open their markets to US goods because they wanted access to our markets, and but they never complied. And we always let them go originally because they're recovering from World War II. When we actually wanted to help them, our government actually pushed some of our industries to seed markets to help them recover. Mm-hmm. And that became the habit. It worked out fine, as we were talking about earlier, because we were so dominant. Around the early 70s, that began to change. But at that point, the doctrine, free trade is good, it's win-win, had been entrenched, and our economists were peddling it pretty hard. And we just sort of kept plowing along and losing our shirts in a way. And on the domestic side, the mistake has been to believe that just leave everything to the market and the private sector will develop innovations and make technical progress. And that is true to a very significant extent, but those are mostly incremental changes. For big breakthrough stuff where you come up with some idea or some theory or some result, and you have no idea how it's going to work out, that's too big a risk, too long a gestation period, and you don't have you can't put numbers on it. It's too risky for the private sector. So that's why we support pure research, but pure research has been the exception to the leave it to the market. But what we have resisted is translational research support, taking the proof of concept in a lab and supporting the enterprises that try to get from there to a viable product in a commercial market. That's the gap. That's the valley of death. That's what it's called in venture capital. That's where we have fallen short in our support of our piece of industrial policy.
Could I ask you about that? Many people in the U.S., certainly many economists, would argue that we got where we are because we have a free market economy. We've always been free traders. Does that fit with our history?
No, it doesn't. That's a good question. Beginning with Hamilton, we have had a policy of developing behind a wall of tariffs. And they've been a little less and a little more, but we've had them in the later years of the 19th century, focused almost entirely on manufacturers. Mm-hmm. And that continued pretty much until the end of World War II, when Secretary of State Seward pushed Roosevelt to take off the tariffs. Part of the impetus was to help our allies redevelop at the end of the war. and to tie them to us, as opposed to the risk that they might go communist. And also the view, which still has kind of held sway through the Clinton administration, that more trade means more chance of peace in the world. It turned out not to be true. It's a nice idea, but it doesn't, fortunately, those things don't always work out. So, and then the story got rewritten. And if you read most histories of, economic histories of the US, it's like it was all free market right from inception. It's simply not true. Every country that is a serious economic power has used industrial policy, whether they call it that or not, to get there. And we have used it. Used it too. We haven't called it that very much.
Well, what do you think of the argument that some economists make, that when you, if the Chinese want to subsidize their exports and sell products below the cost of production, well, that's a gain for us. We get cheaper products. We have cheaper photovoltaics. How would you address that?
Well, it's very short-sighted. One of the big problems, that's basically the theory of comparative advantage, is that, you know, why not let them give us cheap stuff? Well, the question is, several questions. One is, what kind of economy do you want to be in 5 years from now? So if you let them, the other countries, do what they want, they'll make the high-value stuff, it pays more, and they'll sell it to us, and it'll be cheaper for us maybe than it would have been if we used our more expensive labor for it. But the former president of the American Economic Association wrote a very sophisticated book showing that trade-off was a net loss. And it's not hard to see, especially if you take the longer view, which is, do you think cheaper goods at Walmart make up for losing a better paying job manufacturing? And if you stay out of the leading edge industries, if you stay out of leading edge industries today, you won't get into the leading edge industries of tomorrow, because all those things are very path dependent. You don't go from making a transistor to a 2 nanometer chip. You know, there are steps along the way, and you have to be in there. So, and the other thing that that theory just doesn't recognize is that we're not locked into making potato chips or computer chips. I mean, the whole push of industrial policy is to climb the ladder of the low-tech, low-value to high-value industries through government policy. And it's been done successfully. So all the Asian tigers have done it. And we did it as well. We've done it. We haven't called it that, but we certainly did it in aircraft manufacturing, aircraft engine manufacturing. NIH, we're the biggest, you know, producer of new drugs in the world. We don't call it industrial policy. That's health, but it isn't. It's very successful industrial policy, and we now have the world's leading private space industry. That was a highly protected government project. We kept other countries out of it completely for national security reasons. But now we're the leaders, and it was nurtured, you know, through the private sector. I'm sorry, through government policy.
Government policy and government procurement as well, which
exactly.
is often left out.
There's a list of, you know, a list of the tools of industrial policy, and they're really long. I mean, I can show you all those things, different ways, and procurement is a very powerful one. That's what we did to start the aircraft industry under Herbert Hoover. You wanted more planes, and how do you get more planes? You have to have more business. So we said, okay, the U.S. Postal Service should start, you know, air delivery, and that created demand, so people started making airplanes, and on from there.
So the book argues that industrial policy has to be supplemented by uh, uh, both by tariffs, which you touched on briefly, as well as by macro policy in terms of the value of the dollar. Can you explain what those two legs of the stool are about?
Yes. So we think the right way to think about industrial policy is it has three pillars, in whatever order. The first is the one that people most think about today, which is supporting the development, not just of the theory and the pure science, but the commercialization of new technologies that are important. Subsidization is necessary, procurement using a whole battery of tools. But trade policy has to be integrated with it to support it. If you put a lot of money into a new product, and China wants it, and they decide they want to subsidize it, they will subsidize it much more than we politically can do in this country. And we'll just end up with taking the technology for nothing, not for nothing, but we'll lose it. So for us, it's like pouring money into a bucket, and the hole in the bucket doesn't go into the ground, it goes to China.
Right.
So that's the worst thing to do. It's worse than doing nothing.
You're thinking of photovoltaics, for example.
Yeah. There are a number of industries where that has happened and is happening. So that's pillar number two. The third is really a macro one, and that is that the dollar on a trade-weighted basis, of course this changes constantly, but right now it's about 16% overvalued. Now what do we mean by overvalued? Is it something some economists made up? No. The only reason you even think about overvalue, undervalue, is does trade balance or doesn't it? What's supposed to happen with freely floating currencies is that the surplus country's currency becomes more expensive and the deficit country's currency becomes less expensive, which sucks in more goods, and the surplus country sells fewer goods because it's more expensive, and trade balances in that way. Well, that hasn't happened for a very long time. Right. We've run deficits, I think I don't remember when in the 70s, but that's when it started. And there are two reasons for it. One is that countries have consistently, not everybody, but some of the surplus countries have manipulated their currencies, which means they take the dollars that they get from buying our goods and sterilize them. They don't put them back in the market where they would lower the value of the dollar. They stash them away or buy U.S. Treasury bonds. That we need to deal with that. And the way you deal with that is, at least with a country whose currency is allowed to float, is you buy their currency. Our Treasury would buy their currency and therefore drive up its value. It doesn't cost you anything because you're getting something of equal value, the currency. But the bigger factor today in the trade deficit is the big net influx of capital into the U.S. And this is from the private sector. This has nothing to do with government manipulation. And this is trillions of dollars coming into U.S. securities. Lots going out, but much, much less. So the flood of incoming capital increases the demand for dollars because you have to pay in dollars for these securities, and pushes up the value of the dollar. So, and of course, if we're fighting inflation and the Fed raises interest rates, that sucks in more capital because those securities pay more. So how do you deal with this? I mean, one way or another, we needed a set of capital controls to do that. It's at CPA, where I'm a vice chair, we worked on a bill which would basically enact a market charge, like a tax, but a market charge on incoming capital. Senator Tammy Baldwin and Josh Hawley introduced a bill for this market charge in 2019. So let's say we won't choose China just for a change. Let's say you're a French institution and you want to buy U.S. stocks or Treasury bonds. And the yield is whatever it is, and so you'd have to come to get in. You'd have to pay, let's say the market charges 3%. You'd have to pay 3% more, and your net yield would be less. So, and the idea would be that that charge would be adjusted more or less as needed to reduce the excess flow into the U.S. and drive the dollar down. And you'd be, Treasury or the Fed would be moving it around basically until trade got into more or less rough balance. We figure over 5 or 6 years you could get it into balance with maybe ending up with a 5% charge. A lot of revenue. You can collect a lot of revenue in the meantime. And that would actually give the Fed more freedom to act domestically without messing up our situation in foreign exchange and vice versa. But this is the sleeper issue, the third pillar. This is just beginning to be slightly talked about in policy circles.
Well, these two other pillars, you mentioned the trade policy and the industrial policies. How do you think we ought to work the trade policy, or what would be your book of responses? Would you actively put tariffs on photovoltaics, for example, or the next example, when they're going to try and flood the market?
Yes, exactly. Tariffs work. They can be more or less complicated, but they're relatively simple, and they do work.
Yeah. Aren't we moving in that direction, though? The EVs, they just, if I'm not mistaken, it's 100% tariff on...
Yeah, EVs from China.
From China.
That's right. Whether that'll be enough, I don't know. You know, it depends on how much they want to subsidize.
Yeah, exactly. There can be a subsidy war.
But you know, you can do quotas too. You don't have to. It doesn't have to be a tariff, or it can be a tariff rate quota. You know, quota up to so much, and then over that it's a big tariff. So there are a variety of ways to do it, but that's or equivalents are the basic tools to protect the industry that you're talking about. Now, tariffs have had a bad rap from the neoclassical economists for forever, and it's the same. They use the same analyses they use to predict that every free trade agreement we enter into will decrease our trade deficit. Right. Everyone we've entered into with a significant other economy, our trade deficit has shot up afterwards. And then they do the same kind of bad analysis for the effect of tariffs. First of all, the consumer doesn't pay them all. The rest of the chain pays some of it, and the consumer pays some of it. Depends on the flexibilities and how much money they're making. If the consumer paid none of it, it wouldn't be successful. It wouldn't be doing what we want. So. And then the other thing is it's such a short-term analysis. What it ignores is the investment stimulative effect of the tariff. We can see this with the steel tariffs. I don't know, prices shot up a little bit at the beginning. It very quickly stimulated a lot of multi-billion-dollar investment in new plant by the steel industry, and the new plant's considerably modernized, much more efficient, and as long as they have confidence, those tariffs are going to be there for a while. And those are the quick wins for industrial policy. When you're pursuing a brand new breakthrough technology, it's much longer before you get the big effect. But that's also a reason why the timing question is one of the reasons why we shouldn't just think of industrial policy as just high tech. We have what we're calling the whole category of industries, either very advantageous to not advantageous. There are a lot in the middle, which are big employers, pay good salaries, and do advance, but more incrementally. and combustion engine cars, making those, for example. Not easy to do, but not really cutting edge. The increment has been, but you don't want to lose an industry like that.
Well, how would you take the charge that the traditional economists would make that you're trying to freeze the structure of the economy? We should evolve and move towards services, and we can leave lower value add and move on to the next level. Do you accept that analysis, or?
Well, you know, it sounds good, but it depends on three things. Those analyses always, first of all, they assume full employment, which isn't always true. It's true today, but then the other big assumption is, okay, if you let these industries go, that there will be a better job in a better industry waiting for the people who lose their jobs in the old industry. And especially where you're losing the advantageous industries, that's not true. And it hasn't been true for us. It's a big step down to go from making steel to working in a McDonald's.
Yes.
So, and those analyses always assume that the capital resources of the lost industry will be somehow not just lost, but productively redeployed, that it's friction-free and cost-free. People will move where jobs are. Very difficult and people don't like to do that, and they resist.
Well, they have houses which are no longer worth as much.
Exactly,
They can't sell.
and they have friends and family.
Right.
And a lot of small communities have gotten totally almost obliterated, and people are angry. I don't blame them.
What one of the advantages, if you want to call it that, of a more free market approach is that it requires less coordination. What you're suggesting in terms of these three pillars may require, a more proactive approach towards managing the economy. What sort of structures do you see as necessary to help that process?
Well, first of all, the free market has to remain the engine. There's nothing like it. So the key thing, I think conceptually from 5,000 feet, is to think of government setting some basic directions and creating the portfolio of really, breakthrough technologies, but it has to be a big portfolio because you really don't know, will the technology work? And you don't know, will there be a commercial need for it? So, but if you have 100 ventures and one hits the target, like the internet or computer chips, eventually the nation is much better off for it. So you think about that, and then the government needs to help coordinate these other policies to support the thrust into these industries, but be prepared to facilitate and hand off to the private sector as soon as the risk-reward equation gets to the point where the private sector can take it on. Because from that point forward, if government tried to do it, they would screw it up. I mean, there's nothing like the free market. But how do you organize that within the government? Is that part of your question?
Or is there some other, public-private sort of arrangement that can help to coordinate some of these activities?
Well, you really, except for the pure science and maybe sort of the first conception prototype in a lab, the private sector has to be very deeply involved, both if you have a portfolio, you need people in the government, you need people from universities, you need people from venture capital, and you need scientists on the commissions that do that, and they need to have some independence. And the government's done pretty well on that. I mean, another example of a regional organization or a cluster that's done that beautifully is the Massachusetts Life Science Cluster. They have a good array of that mix of people who evaluate the project initially and then evaluate them As they go through, they have clawbacks if they don't meet their employment targets, which is the one thing you can't fake. You're either hiring them or not. And of course, they have a source of NIH feeding in the raw material, so to speak. But under Deval Patrick, that cluster grew. There was a cluster, and it was a significant one. But now the Boston area is the largest, life sciences cluster in the entire world. It's been very effective.
You make the point in the book that not only did they take 2 points there. One, they already had very significant assets, not least the universities,
Right.
and they already had established companies, but they added a lot of money. So often we have a problem of scale in this country where we have a good idea and we'll put in 10 million when you need 100 million.
Yeah, that's why industrial policy is not once and done,
Yes.
unfortunately, I guess. And here's an example. We spend a lot of money on the mission stuff, health, NIH, defense. That hasn't been considered industrial policy. They get lots of money, but the two major initiatives that are economically focused for the whole country's economy, Manufacturing USA and the Manufacturing Extension Program, which is for smaller businesses, are very underfunded. For Manufacturing USA, more of them were established in the CHIPS and Science Act, which is really good, but the authorization was actually cut. It's now $829 million over the next 6 or 7 years, and compares to $1 billion a year for the Fraunhofer Institutes in Germany, and they're 20% of the population.
Actually, excuse me, it's more like $3.4 billion a year. It's for Fraunhofer, seriously.
A year?
Yeah.
Good. I'm making my point even better.
Yes,
Thank you.
No, that's why I made it, and they're a third our size.
20% more or less.
Yeah. And
so that's striking. We do have other things that they don't have, so it's not exactly apples to apples.
Right.
But
Good
it
point.
really makes the point. And robotics and other key technology is even worse. Just dwarfed by other countries, including China. China is many times the amount of money spent, many more equivalent. They copied our manufacturing institutes. So size really does matter.
Well, you have 2 points there. One is learning from others, where the Chinese are learning from us. There have been successes. I mean, Albany was modeled on the Fraunhofers, and you cite that in the book as a case of success. But we do have the CHIPS Act. How do you view that big effort in light of what you've written here?
Yeah, I think it's excellent. I mean, it's desperately needed. I think generally well targeted. This book is written at more or less the 5,000-foot level. We don't really purport to be able to follow the implementation of that act in detail, and how it's done is important. But even there, what I hope doesn't happen is that Intel's having a hard time. They're getting a lot of money. We shouldn't give up.
Right.
There are very few cases where we need to have national champions, and this is one of them, because there is no equivalent to Intel. At least we got rid of my two professions as head of Intel, lawyers and financiers. We've got a real technical guy. Hopefully he's a good manager, but generally people who really understand the science of these businesses do a better job.
Could I follow up on that? Would you advocate sustained and perhaps larger support for Intel from the government? In the past, when GM fails, of course we wait till they fail, and then in bankruptcy we run in to try and save them. But we don't seem to have many tools to help a company that has a crucial role like Intel.
Well, let me just give you a counterexample. I've got some notes on this here. Where is it? Give me a second. Well, I can't find it, but anyway, the contrast is with Taiwan, which already has the world leading foundry for chips and a whole ecosystem. They continue to pay, even now, huge amounts of money, huge proportions of the cost of constructing the fab, the equipment, whatever every conceivable form.
45% and 55%. Yes,
Yeah.
it's really quite.
Every year,
Yes.
that's on a continuing thing. That's a very unusual industry. It's highly cyclic, and the cost of the next fab for the next generation of chips is huge. So that may be one where we not only have to be prepared to prop up hopefully get our national champion back on board and ideally have at least two so they can compete internally, but also be prepared to provide really massive support on a continuing basis. That's certainly not the ideal, but if it's important enough, we do that with the military. This is almost like the military now.
Well,
So there is this sense of urgency that when you read the book, you can't escape that sense of mission and urgency that you convey. So as we begin to conclude this conversation, how what are the stakes for the United States, both in terms of national security and innovation and economic security?
Well, the U.S. is a big country. It has a lot of strength. It's a wealthy country. We have capital to invest. We have more capital per person than almost any other country. So we can do this, but we really have to get on it because we've lost so much ground. And if our politics get even more confrontational, we won't be able to do anything politically. I'm really more likely that if we fail, that we fail because we can't make decisions, good decisions. But we need to get on this. I am actually quite optimistic now, not because, we've taken some initial steps. Trump was instrumental in throwing a wrench in the trade gears that had to be done, and Biden has really stepped on, the other pillar. He's gotten it started. But I'm optimistic because we've started, but also because of the politics. This is not a Republican versus, fortunately, Democratic issue. The parties are divided horizontally, not so much between them. Each of them has factions growing that support the basic idea. They may come at it a little bit differently. You've got Josh Hawley and Senator Baldwin, Democrats and Republicans. You've got the Senator Warren and Rubio, and there are people. The Republican chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee is sympathetic to a number of these things. So that the usual political divisions, fortunately, don't seem to apply, and that's really important because for any of these policies to have staying power and long-term support, which is critical. One of the UK's failures is every time they switch parties, they trash that policy.
Exactly.
This is not a short-term thing. So, but that makes me very optimistic, actually.
Well, if I could just say, I think you deserve, for people like ourselves who've worked in this space for 20 years, you really deserve a vote of thanks because it's a myth buster by capturing the history. You have the case studies which demonstrates what can be done, and you also have a series of practical recommendations, institutional recommendations on how to address it, and I think that's a great service.
As we are anticipating a new administration of whichever color, I think this book provides a huge resource of understanding of what our challenges, what we've done in the past, and as a way of thinking more strategically ahead in terms of a more balanced approach to how do we think about some of these challenges of staying comparatively ahead in some of these leading technologies on which our economy is based and on which our national security is predicated as well. So it's a very, very important service that you've done. So thank you so much for
Well,
this.
thank you very much.
Thanks.
I hope it meets, hope to help meet those challenges.
Well, you no doubt have.
Thank you so much.